If you're a new teacher, listen up. Maybe you're finding that your lessons aren't going where you want them to, that your students aren't learning what they're supposed to, or even worse, you don't even know if they're learning at all. In terms of lesson planning, one of the biggest mistakes that newer teachers make is not really using the standards to their advantage to point them in the right direction and guide them in their teaching. In today's video, I'm going to cover how to find and utilize state standards so that you can finally plan lessons that work. I'm even going to lead you through the process of how I would look for standards if I were a new teacher or if I was teaching a new subject, a new grade, or in a new state, so that you can see how you can do the same process, especially if you were given nothing when you first started teaching. Be sure to stay till the end so that you can see also how I would look for materials and lesson plans that align with these standards. So the first aspect of lesson planning is to know why we have the standards and what they even are. In a nutshell, the standards are what the state expects students to know by the time they leave a certain grade. And of course, that then dictates what it is that we teach. Now, I remember when I started teaching English, especially, I kind of glossed over the standards. I'm not going to lie. I was like, okay, cool. They're supposed to read, they're supposed to write, they're supposed to do all of this. But I didn't actually look deep into the standards, and I just kind of went on my merry way, teaching whatever. But when I actually sat down and looked at them and looked at how they line up with what I was actually teaching, I really realized why my students weren't learning as much as they could. I saw that my students were maybe writing a little bit better, but not that much better, that they were analyzing, but not much more than they had in the beginning of the year. And it wasn't until I broke down the standards and really looked at them carefully that I knew where the gaps were in what I was teaching, and then I was better able to fill in those gaps. So now that we agree on what the standards are, and why they're important, so important, is we need to unpack them. That's the next aspect of lesson planning. And unpacking the standards is a term that's used a lot in education. It's basically the idea of breaking them down, looking at them closely, and then making it apply to our teaching. So you're going to look at each standard, you're going to see how in-depth you're supposed to teach that particular skill or standard, what it should look like when the students are doing that. How can you combine multiple standards together into one lesson? We're just basically getting down to the nitty-gritty. So to demonstrate this, I am going to look up the standards for a subject I've never taught, in a grade I've never taught, in a state that I've never lived in, so that you can see how I would unpack the standards. I am literally here on Google, and I am going to be searching for some state standards, showing you guys how I would do this as a new teacher. Now, for those of you that are listening on the podcast, I invite you, if you're not driving, of course, because #safety, I would invite you to follow along on your phone. You can just open a browser on your phone and you can do this as well. So I'm in Google, and let's choose a state. Minnesota. Science. I've never taught science. Let's do 4th grade. So right away it says Minnesota Science Standards 4th grade. So I'm going to click on that. And of course, the education website for the state of Minnesota is the first result. So I'm going to click on that. And here it says the Minnesota Department of Education. So you can see on the page under science, there's a block of text, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read. And then they have a bunch of links here to the Minnesota Academic Standards in Science. And I am going to choose the most recent one because they have one from 2009, 2010, and 2019. I'm definitely going to choose the one in 2019. And that downloaded a PDF for me. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. For the Minnesota Science Standards, it says a 3-dimension summary. Dimension 1 is science and engineering practices, 2 is cross-cutting concepts, and 3 is disciplinary core ideas. I'm sure if I was a science teacher or I knew more about science, I'd probably understand what that means. But if you read the little description here, it says like asking questions, analyzing, interpreting data, and then cause and effect, energy and matter. That sounds like sciencey stuff. So I get that. And then it says organization of the standards. For the science standards in Minnesota, they call them strands. So they have the strands and the substrands. So for example, strand 1 is exploring phenomena or engineering problems. And then there are 2 substrands, so that asking questions and planning and carrying out investigation. So I can see that there are 4 strands, and each strand has 2 substrands. There are benchmarks. So this is what students are supposed to master at certain grades. And I'm looking through that, and it says how to read the standards and benchmarks. Now this one is important. So if you're listening on the podcast, there's multiple numbers for each benchmark. So it would be like 5, which is the grade, 1.2.1.3. So they have strand, substrand, standard, and benchmark. And then they also have a letter. So like E for earth and space science, L for life science, P for physical science, 9C for chemistry, and 9P for physics. So here they have an example for grade 5. And then they have the strand, the substrand, the standard, and then the benchmark. And the number comes out to 5L.1.2.1.3. Now, you can do a couple of things as you're looking through these standards. You can just look at your grade in isolation, which is totally fine to start out. I could scroll down here to 4th grade, and I can see what the benchmarks are. You can also do what we call vertical aligning, where I can look at that particular benchmark in 3rd grade, see what they learned in 3rd grade, and compare it to what they should know at the end of 4th grade. So that way I have an idea of the knowledge that they should be coming with in that particular benchmark. And then also, what am I preparing them for in 5th grade? You can look at it both ways. In the beginning, though, I would just focus on your particular grade and your benchmarks. And then later on, as you get comfortable with those, then you can start looking at the grade prior and the grade after. So I'm going to just pick the first one that I see here for 4th grade. And it says exploring phenomena or engineering problems. That's this first strand. The substrand is asking questions and defining problems. And then standard. Students will be able to ask questions about aspects of phenomena they observe. Okay, so they're going to ask questions about the phenomena they observe, the conclusions they draw from their models or scientific investigations, each other's ideas, and the information they read. So this particular standard, they're really looking at students' ability to ask questions. So if you look at the benchmark, it says, ask questions to determine cause and effect relationships of electric and magnetic interactions between 2 objects not in contact with each other. So it gets like super specific, but that's because this particular benchmark has to do with physical science and physics. So that's why that benchmark is talking about cause and effect, electric and magnetic. So that makes sense to me. Them asking questions, which means they're going to have some kind of interaction with electric and magnetic materials. They need to interact, and students have to be able to observe that and ask questions about cause and effect relationships. Do you see how I broke that down? And yeah, it's kind of daunting to go through all of them. You need to go through all of them. You need to see what you're supposed to be teaching your kids. Now, if you teach science, and I'm preaching to the choir here, you have a lot that you need to teach because you're doing earth science, you're doing physics and chemistry. And I'm going to pretend like I looked through all of these. So if you're finding this information useful and you're like,
I wish they had gone this in depth when I was in college or learning how to be a teacher.
Be sure to like this video and hit subscribe because, you know, the algorithm. So now that we've unpacked the standards, the next aspect of lesson planning that we need to pay attention to is the scope and sequence. So the scope involves the topics and the concepts that you're supposed to teach within a curriculum. And the sequence is it's the order of the lessons. Now, how do you find the scope and sequence? This is not an easy answer. If you go on your state website, the Department of Education website, you're going to find that there's not really a scope or sequence. That's because it's a little bit subjective, to be honest. I've seen different scopes and sequences depending on the curriculum. So first of all, we need to figure out, do you have a curriculum from your district? And if you do you have to follow it to a T? Meaning, like, you have to do this lesson on this day and say these words. If you do, well, you've got your scope and sequence figured out. Now, let's say that you have a curriculum, but you have a little more leeway and freedom. Then what I would suggest that you do is that you do follow the scope and sequence in the book at first. And then as you teach longer, you're going to realize, you know what, I actually want to teach this concept a little bit later because X, Y, and Z. Or maybe with your PLC or your department or grade level, you can discuss whether or not you want to follow the scope and sequence of the curriculum that's provided for you. Now, if you don't have a set curriculum, another thing that you can do is just go online and Google, literally Google, scope and sequence for science or scope and sequence for math 8. And you can see what other people are doing across the country. That's something that I found to be really useful because they've thought of scope and sequences that maybe I didn't think of. And I'm always trying to find better ways to teach my students and to make it so that my teaching is more effective. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I really discourage you to try to come up with your own scope and sequence your first or second or even third year of teaching. You have so much other things that you need to focus on, classroom management, things like that, paperwork. And so use what other people have, and you want to use a scope and sequence that other people have tried and tested and can attest to the fact that it works. So now that I have unpacked the standards, I'm going to go and see what the scope and sequence is. I need to know, like, in what order are people teaching them. I'm just going to look up Science Scope and Sequence 4th grade. So someone on Teachers Pay Teachers has a science scope and sequence, and this one is free. That would be something to explore downloading if you teach 4th grade science. Thank you to this person, and kind of see what order they're going. So I found one. I'd probably download that and take a look at that scope and sequence. Remember, we're looking for the order that we're going to be teaching these concepts, and then also like how in-depth we're going to go. Here, the Oxford Area School District, they have a science grade 4 curriculum with scope and sequence. That looks really promising. It goes through the order that they do things. Okay, so this one starts out with organisms and cells, evolution, genetics, chemistry, physics, earth science, origin of the evolution and of universe. This is exactly what I was looking for. This one really breaks it down to the concepts and the competencies, which is exactly what I need because I'm going to be teaching this fresh and new. And assuming that I'm a science major, I know what all of this stuff is, then this would make sense to me. I would start out here, like it says, 3.1.4.A, organisms and cells, and it tells me what I should be teaching. Now I'm going to take that information and then I'm going to go look for a lesson for that particular standard or benchmark. So after we have looked at the state standards, unpacked them, and we've looked at the scope and sequence, the next aspect of lesson planning is to look for materials. Now I'm going to tell you again, don't try to come up with materials on your own. Go ahead and see if your colleagues have materials that they're willing to let you use. Usually teachers do that, but I have heard of teachers not doing that, which is kind of bizarre to me, but you know, it is what it is. So what I would do is I would literally Google lesson plan, meaning I would Google the subject. I would Google the number of the standard, you know, or it's like 5.1.1.2.3 or something like that. And then just see what pops up. And I assure you, you're going to see a lot of free resources on the internet that you can look at and that you can see if they're going to work for you. Now, let's pretend like I found 4P.1.1.1.1. I'm going to look up Minnesota Science 4P.1.1.1.1, and I'm going to see what I come up with. There's quite a bit here. Obviously, they have the Minnesota Department of Education website. The second one is something called Generation Genius. It says Minnesota Standards Alignment, and there's a bunch of standards here, so I'm going to search again for that. And it says magnets and static electricity. So when I did Control F or Command F, depending on what you use, and I pasted that standard, it came to a link. And then they have lesson materials. I don't know if I can get all of them. It includes the vocabulary, discussion questions with this video, reading material, and then they have narration, and you can download this lesson as a PDF. So that's pretty cool. That's something that I could start using tomorrow if I took a look at this thoroughly. So I didn't even have to pay for it. I probably have to sign up for something and get a bunch of emails from them, but I'm okay with that. At this point, something's done for me. And going back to that page, they have a lesson, a lot of the standards. I mean, some of them aren't covered, but they have lessons for a lot of them. So I feel good about this one. I would just keep doing this process and looking for any other free materials just so I can wrap my brain around what types of activities and how in depth I'm supposed to go for this particular standard in this particular grade. So after I've asked my colleagues for materials, I've exhausted all the free materials on the internet, then and only then am I going to go to Teachers Pay Teachers. And here's why. You're just starting out. You probably don't want to dish out a bunch of money on lessons at this point. your first paycheck probably was pretty sad, let's be honest. So I don't necessarily think that you should be paying for that right now. Now, there are kind of two camps about how teachers pay teachers work, and in terms of teachers selling their lessons, there are some people who think that all of this should be free. I can see why they would think that, because we're here to help everybody out, right? But at the same time, there's the other side where there are teachers that make their own products and they spend a lot of time and effort and their own money to make these products, and they feel like they should be compensated for that time. Considering that I also sell some stuff on Teachers Pay Teachers, you can tell which camp I'm in. I do give my materials for free to my PLC, to the other teachers that teach 7th grade English. And anytime that I mentor a new teacher, I also give them all of my materials, but then I also sell it on Teachers Pay Teachers to other people as well. Now, not all lessons on Teachers Pay Teachers are created equal. I think you might know this. And I'm not here to bash any of the creators on Teachers Pay Teachers. I just know that not all of them are going to work for me. So when I first look at the obvious, I look at the number of downloads. I also look at the rating. Although that doesn't always say whether or not a resource is good, because some people leave really random ratings. I don't get it, but they leave ratings that sometimes have nothing to do with the product. So I'll look at that first, and then I will look at the product itself, and I'll look at the preview. And pretty much every single product on Teachers Pay Teachers has a preview. From there, I'll look closely at the materials that are included. I've been known to like zoom in, because sometimes they have like little shots of the different worksheets, and I'll zoom in to see, are these questions all low level thinking? Is there a mix of high, medium, and low level thinking? Because sometimes they're just comprehension questions. Sometimes I don't like the way that certain concepts are worded. I don't like the format of the graphic organizer. So I'm going to look closely at it to see if it's something that I think my students would benefit from. I don't get caught up in pretty fonts, pretty font pairings, or clip art or anything like that, because honestly, my students don't need that. My students need something that's going to help them organize their ideas, collect information, and then synthesize it. So I look really closely at that. And if it's the first time that you bought a particular product from a seller, then I wouldn't buy it in a bundle. I'm sure you've seen how sometimes different lessons will be bundled together, and you might be tempted to go for that for the cost savings. But what if one lesson you realize isn't any good for you? Like, what if you buy it and you realize, I really don't like this lesson at all? Now you're stuck with a whole bundle of it. So I would buy one lesson and I would test it out. And then if you do like it and they offer a bundle, then I'd go for the bundle. Also, before I pay any money, I will download their freebie. Pretty much every seller on there has a freebie, so I would download it and look at it just to assess the quality and to see whether or not their style of graphic organizer or the way that they word things, that it's something that I agree with and that I think would be useful. So that way you don't have to spend any money yet. You can just, get a preview of what's to come. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to look at Teachers Pay Teachers. Naturally, I already saw something at Teachers Pay Teachers, so why not see if I can find some more lessons? And remember, at this point, I've already talked to my colleagues that teach the same grade and the same subject, if they have anything that they could give me in terms of materials or scope and sequence. And then I looked online on Google for free to see if I could find anything, which I did. But that's probably not going to be enough, because that was one lesson for that particular standard. I'm probably going to have to do some reteaching, or at least cover it a little bit later on again. So I'm here on Teachers Pay Teachers, and I am just going to put the standard. Let's see what comes at 4P.1. Maybe I should say science. I should say science. So I'm going to look up science. I want to look for something that's 4th grade that has to do with magnets. So I'm going to click on 4th grade on the left side. Here it says scientific method sorting activities. They have some other stuff, like it has Earth and space, but I'm not finding what I want. So I'm going to go back to the standard. I'm going to look up more of the language. And I'm going to look at electric and magnetic interactions. I'm going to copy that. Let me see if I can find that. And under subject, let's go ahead and press science. I kind of just like typed in whatever to see what would happen. So now, what kind of lessons do we have? Science, vocabulary, word wall, physical science semester PowerPoints. Ooh, that's $39. It's PowerPoints for the whole semester. Oh, here we go, magnets and magnetic fields. So that would work, but do I really want the rest of this? I'm not sure, because there's also not a preview. There's like these little thumbnails, but there's not a preview. And it's just PowerPoint, so there aren't actual... I mean, this could help because it has presentations for each of those concepts. And if you look at this one, there's a lot of concepts. I still want to see more information on whether or not I should get this, because for $39, it's got to be good. Let's look at this one. This one is 4th through 6th grade. This one does have magnetism stuff if it's never been taught before. So this one might work. It's $3.50. Let's view the preview. And the preview wants me to log in. So pretend that I viewed the preview. Based on these little thumbnails, it actually looks pretty cool. It looks like they have some experiments on here, and it leads the students through experiments, and then it has areas for the students to write down their observations. So this one might be good. So we covered a lot today. If you found this useful, be sure to subscribe, because I'm going to continue on with this lesson planning series. And then in the future, I'm even going to go into how to deliver a lesson that engages your students, especially for those students that are zoning out, spacing out, and kind of bouncing off the wall. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on that. Also, be sure to check out this video, which is going to help you on your lesson planning journey.